What if the man the entire town called cold, arrogant, and proud was actually carrying a wound so deep he could barely speak? And what if the woman everyone called stubborn was holding a pair of tiny shoes that no child ever got to wear? This is the story of two broken people in a dusty Texas town, a stolen deed, a corrupt lawyer, and the quiet, earth-shaking moment when a man steps into a room not to fight your battle, but to make sure you can win it yourself. Stay with me, because what unfolds between these two will change the way you see silence, strength, and what real love actually looks like.
Dawn didn't politely arrive in Redemption Creek. It broke through the autumn fog like a dull knife, September of 1878. The air carried a sharp, cold bite. Abigail Montgomery was already at work. 5 o'clock in the morning. The town was just starting to stir, coughing up the dust of the Texas plains. Abby didn't wait for the sun. She had a market stall to build. She stood in the dirt, swinging a heavy iron hammer, driving nails into the pine boards of her display table. Thwack, thwack, precise, unrelenting. A passing merchant, a man who sold imported cloth, paused. He tipped his bowler hat. Heavy work for a widow, Mrs. Montgomery. Step aside. Let a man handle that for you. Abby didn't break her rhythm. She didn't look up. My hammer weighs exactly the same as yours, Mr. Vance, she said, her voice smooth but firm. And my nails drive just as straight. Good morning to you. The merchant scoffed, muttered something about stubbornness, and walked on. Abby set her jaw. She didn't need a savior. She needed this wood to hold steady. A woman in this world didn't survive by waiting for a man to build her foundation. She built it herself, even if her hands bled doing it. She laid out her wares, 20 jars of homemade jam, deep red plum, wild strawberry, a row of beeswax candles, bunches of dried foliage, and yarrow hanging from a twine string. Behind her, 15-year-old Ellie sat on an overturned crate, quietly sketching her mother's calloused hands in a small notebook. By 7 o'clock, the market was loud, crowded. Then the noise shifted. A ripple of quiet moved through the center aisle. Silas Thorne had arrived. He rode a tall, copper-colored gelding. His 10-year-old son, Caleb, sat tall in the saddle in front of him. Silas dismounted. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered, weathered skin, eyes like dark, polished wood. The town's wealthy banker tipped his hat eagerly. Morning, Mr. Thorne. Excellent weather for the herds. Silas walked right past him. Didn't blink, didn't nod. Instead, Silas locked eyes with an old, stooped Mexican man sweeping the boardwalk outside the saloon. Silas touched the brim of his hat, a silent, deeply respectful greeting. The old man stood a little taller and tipped his broom in return. Silas didn't care about the money in your pocket. He cared about the dirt on your boots. He walked through the market, quiet, taking up space without trying to. He only came to town for supplies he couldn't grow or forge. Wire, nails, paper. He never lingered. But Caleb was 10, and 10-year-old boys didn't care about wire. Caleb caught a scent on the wind. Sweetness. Earth. He slipped away from his father's side and let his nose guide him. He stopped dead in front of Abby's stall. Abby was wiping down the counter. Her back ached. Her hands were raw. She was calculating whether she'd make enough today to buy Ellie a new winter coat. The heavy weight of survival was pressing down on her shoulders. Then she looked up. A boy stood there, big brown eyes, staring at a jar of wild strawberry jam like it held the secrets of the universe. His mouth hung open a little, pure, unfiltered wonder. Abby stopped. The exhaustion melted away. The hard, protective shell she wore for the town cracked. And for a second, just one brief second, Abigail Montgomery smiled. It wasn't a polite smile. It wasn't the practiced grin of a merchant trying to make a coin. It was real. radiant. It reached her storm-gray eyes and softened the tired lines around her mouth. It was a smile that remembered something beautiful. 15 paces away, Silas Thorne froze. He had turned to look for his son, but he found the smile instead. He stood perfectly still. The chaotic noise of the market faded into a low hum. He hadn't seen anything that beautiful, that unguarded, in a very long time. It hit him square in the chest. "Pa," Caleb called out, pointing a dirty finger. "Look at the red one." Silas blinked. The noise of the market rushed back in. He stepped forward, closing the distance to the stall. Abby's smile faded back into polite composure as the massive shadow of the rancher fell over her table. She looked up at Silas. He didn't speak. He just pointed a thick, calloused finger at the wild strawberry jam. He reached into his coat, pulled out a silver dollar, and set it on the wood. "That jar is 70 cents, Mr. Thorne," Abby said quietly. She picked up the jam, handed it to the boy, and then scooped 30 cents from her cash box. She held the coins out to Silas. Silas looked at the money. Then he looked at her. He shook his head. A small gesture. "Keep it." Abby's hand didn't drop. Her spine went perfectly rigid. The polite merchant vanished. "Mr. Thorne," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the morning air like a whip. "Take your change." Silas raised an eyebrow. He wasn't used to being told what to do. Abby held his gaze. She didn't flinch. "Fairness is how the working class retains their dignity," she told him, the words carrying the weight of a woman who had fought for every inch of ground she stood on. "I sell my labor. I sell my time. What I do not sell, and what I will not accept, is a plea for charity. I am not a beggar. Take your change." Silence stretched between them. A heavy, charged second. Caleb looked back and forth between his father and the widow, clutching his jam. Silas looked deep into Abby's gray eyes. He saw the fierce pride there, the unbending iron. He realized his mistake. He hadn't offered a tip. He had unintentionally offered pity. Slowly, Silas reached out. His large fingers brushed her palm as he took the 3 dimes. He didn't say a word, but he gave her a sharp, definitive nod. Respect, absolute and complete. He turned and walked away, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. Abby watched his broad back disappear into the crowd. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Her hand was tingling. Ellie looked up from her notebook. "He actually took the change, Ma." "He did," Abby murmured. She went back to arranging her herbs, but her mind wasn't on the sage or the yarrow. It was on the dark-eyed man who listened to a woman say no and actually heard her. By 2 o'clock, the Texas sun was a hammer. The morning fog had burned off hours ago. Now, the air above the market dirt shimmered with heat. Redemption Creek was tired. Vendors wiped sweat from their necks. Horses stamped lazily in the shade. Abby wiped down her wooden counter with a damp rag. She had sold 6 jars of jam, a handful of candles. It was enough to keep the wolves from the door for another week. Barely. She was just untying the string of yarrow when the market went quiet again. It wasn't a sudden silence. It was a slow fade, like a wave pulling back from the shore. Abby looked up. Silas Thorne was walking back down the center aisle. No horse this time. No boy. Just the man himself. He moved with heavy, deliberate steps. The dust settled around his boots. The townspeople watched. Martha Higgins, the innkeeper, leaned over a barrel of apples and nudged the blacksmith. Whispers started like dry leaves in the wind. "What's the ironwood boss doing back? Look at where he's heading. Must taken a liking to the widow." Throwing his money around, Silas didn't hear them. Or if he did, he didn't care. He walked straight to Abby's stall and stopped. Abby straightened her spine. She kept her hands resting lightly on the wood. "Mr. Thorne," Did you need another jar? Silas didn't answer right away. He reached into his leather vest. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. He laid it flat on her counter. He looked at the jars, at the hanging herbs, at the woven baskets. Then he looked at her. He took a breath. It looked like it took effort. When he spoke, the sound was rough, like two stones grinding together. Deep, grating, and forced. How much? He swallowed hard. For all of it, the whisperers at the neighboring stalls gasped. Martha Higgins fanned herself. A rich man buying a widow's entire stall. It was the loudest declaration of courtship Redemption Creek had seen in a decade. A display of power, a flex of wealth. Abby didn't gasp. She frowned. She looked at the man. She saw the tension in his jaw. She saw the slight wince when he pushed the words out of his ruined throat. This wasn't a man trying to show off. I don't sell my stall, Mr. Thorne, Abby said. Her voice was steady, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. I sell supplies. What exactly do you need? Silas tapped the paper. Abby picked it up. It wasn't a shopping list. It was a ledger of misery, written in sharp, hasty pencil strokes. 8 men, fever, stomach cramps, started at midnight. Doc Harrison is in Laredo. Need, yarrow, thyme, angelica. Honey, dried ginger, as much as you have. Abby read it twice. The merchant in her vanished. The healer took over. 8 men, she said, her voice dropping. Food poisoning? Silas nodded once. Pork? She asked. Something that sat too long? Another nod. Abby didn't waste another second. She turned her back on him. She reached up and started pulling down every bundle of dried herbs she had. She moved with ruthless efficiency. She grabbed paper, began wrapping. The yarrow and thyme are for the fever. They'll fight the infection in the gut, she said. Not looking at him, just working. Angelica will stop the stomach spasms. The ginger, you boil it. Strong. 1 spoonful every hour. And the honey isn't for sweetness. It coats the stomach lining so they can keep water down. They need water more than anything else. She piled the wrapped bundles on the counter. Then she pushed her jars of jam to the side. You don't need the jam, she said, and you don't need the candles. I won't sell you what you don't need. Silas watched her hands. Fast. Capable. No hesitation. How much? He rasped. 70 cents, Abby said, for the herbs and the honey. Silas put $2 on the table. Abby met his eyes. 70 cents, Mr. Thorne. Silas looked at her. He didn't argue. He picked up the coins, replaced them with exactly 70 cents, gathered the heavy bundles in his massive arms, and walked away. The town gossips looked disappointed. But Abby just went back to wiping her counter. She knew what she had just seen. 10 miles away, the ironwood bunkhouse smelled of sweat and sickness. It was a long wooden building. 8 cots were occupied. The men in them were pale, groaning, and shivering in the Texas heat. They weren't the foremen. They weren't the managers. They were the bottom of the ladder. 3 young Mexican hands, 4 drifters from up north, and Elias, a 60-year-old black man who had been working horses since before the war. Silas kicked the bunkhouse door open. He carried the bundles of herbs. He didn't shout for his housekeeper. He didn't order his healthy hands to do the work. He walked to the cast iron stove in the corner. He built the fire. He boiled the water. For the next 4 hours, the owner of the largest ranch in the county played nursemaid. He moved from cot to cot. He didn't speak. He just lifted heads, held tin cups to cracked lips, poured the bitter ginger and sweet honey down their throats. When he got to Elias, the old man tried to push the cup away. His hands were shaking. No, boss, Elias croaked. His skin was gray with dehydration. You shouldn't be in here. The stink, the mess. I ain't worth you fetching from town. Silas stopped. He set the tin cup on the wooden floor. He knelt beside the low cot. He didn't mind the dirt. He didn't mind the smell. He looked Elias dead in the eyes. Silas forced his throat to work. He pushed past the razor blade pain in his vocal cords. He needed the old man to hear this. Pain doesn't discriminate, Elias. Silas's voice was a harsh, broken whisper, but it filled the quiet space between them. It doesn't care about the color of a man's skin. It doesn't care what's in his pocket. Elias swallowed hard, tears tracking through the dust on his cheeks. You bleed for this land, Silas continued, every word deliberate. Sweat for my brand. A man who builds the foundation deserves to stand on it. Your life is worth exactly the same as mine in this room. You drink, you live. He picked up the cup. He held it to the old man's mouth. Elias drank. Silas didn't ask for thanks. He didn't want gratitude. He just moved to the next cot. Generosity, when true, demands nothing back. It doesn't put the receiver in debt. It simply honors the fact that they are human. Silas Thorne understood this in his bones. He didn't need to say it again. He just kept pouring the water. Wednesday was a quiet day in Redemption Creek. Abby sat on her front porch. The sun was dipping low, casting long golden shadows across the dry grass. She was mending a tear in Elias' wool skirt. The needle dipped in and out of the fabric. A steady, mindless rhythm. A horse trotted up the dirt path. Abby looked up. It was the copper gelding. Caleb Thorne was riding bareback. He slid off the horse with the easy grace of a boy born in the saddle. He walked up the porch steps. He held a brown paper parcel in his hands. He took off his hat. Afternoon, Mrs. Montgomery. Afternoon, Caleb, Abby said, setting her sewing aside. How are the men? All better, ma'am. Pa said to bring these back. Said we didn't use 'em all, and you might need 'em for somebody else. He handed her the parcel. It was the leftover Angelica and thyme, folded neatly. Your father sent you all the way out here just to return herbs? Pa doesn't like keeping things that ain't his, Caleb said simply. Abby smiled softly. I suppose that's a good way to live. Would you like a glass of water before you ride back? Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Abby stood up and led the boy inside. Her house was small, 2 rooms, clean but worn. The floorboards creaked. The smell of dried lavender hung in the air. She went to the pump in the kitchen to draw a glass of water. Caleb stood in the center of the main room. His bright, observant eyes took in the space. He looked at the woven rugs, the neatly stacked firewood. Then, his eyes drifted to a small, wooden shelf mounted near the hearth. There wasn't much on it. A Bible, a tin-type photograph of Abby's late husband, and a pair of tiny, soft leather baby shoes. They were perfectly preserved, never scuffed, never worn. Those are awfully small, Caleb said, pointing. Smaller than my boots when I was a baby, I bet. Whose are they? Abby's hand froze on the pump handle. The water stopped flowing. The house went incredibly still. She didn't turn around right away. She couldn't. Her chest tightened. Wrapping around a block of ice she kept buried very, very deep. They belong to a little boy? Abby said. Her voice was thin, brittle. Where is he? Caleb asked. 10-year-olds didn't know how to dance around ghosts. They just walked right up to them. Abby slowly turned. She looked at Caleb. He stood there. Big brown eyes, the same eyes that had looked at her strawberry jam with such pure, innocent wonder at the market. And in that moment, the truth hit Abby so hard she had to grip the edge of the wooden counter to stay standing. That was why she had smiled. It hadn't been for Silas Thorne. It hadn't been a spark of romance or the flutter of a widow looking for a new husband. When she had looked at Caleb at the market, she hadn't just seen a boy. She had seen a ghost. She had seen Samuel. Samuel, born 7 years ago. 2 months too early. He had breathed for exactly 1 hour before the Texas cold took him. She had bought those leather shoes 3 months before he was born. She had imagined him wearing them, running through the market, pointing at jars of jam. When Caleb had stood before her stall, looking at the red jam with his mouth open, Abby had seen the alternate reality she was denied. She saw the boy Samuel never got to be. Her smile at the market had been a greeting to her lost son, a moment of pure, heartbreaking imagination. It was grief disguised as joy. Silas had bought her entire stall because he thought that beautiful smile was meant for him, or at least meant for his family. He thought he had witnessed a moment of light. He didn't know it was born from the darkest night of her life. "Mrs. Montgomery?" Caleb's voice pulled her back. He looked worried. "Did I say something wrong?" Abby swallowed the lump in her throat. She forced her hands to let go of the counter. She picked up the glass of water and handed it to him. "No, Caleb, you didn't say anything wrong." She managed a small, sad smile. "That little boy, he went to heaven a long time ago, before he could wear the shoes." Caleb looked down at the glass. He understood loss. His mother was gone. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "It must be awful sad to keep his shoes." "It is," Abby whispered. "But it's better to be sad and remember than to forget." Caleb drank his water, tipped his hat, and went back to his horse. Abby stood in the doorway and watched him ride away. She turned back into the house. Ellie was standing in the doorway of the bedroom. She had heard. Ellie was 15. She had been 8 when Samuel died. But Abby had sent her to a neighbor's house during the birth. Abby had never spoken of it since. She had buried the baby, packed away the grief, and went back to work, because that's what pioneer women did. They survived. Ellie looked at the tiny shoes. Then she looked at her mother. "You never talk about him," Ellie said softly. Abby walked over to the shelf. Her hands trembled as she reached out. She took the tiny leather shoes down. She held them in her palms. They weighed nothing at all. Tears finally broke past her eyelashes. Hot and silent, Ellie crossed the room and wrapped her arms around her mother's waist. Abby rested her chin on her daughter's head. She breathed in the scent of her hair. "I thought if I didn't say his name, it wouldn't be real," Abby said, her voice shaking. She pulled back slightly, looking Ellie in the eye. The mother in her needed her daughter to understand this. "Listen to me, Ellie," Abby said clearly, wiping her face. "This world tells women that we have to be stone. It tells us that if we cry, we are weak, that if we mourn too long, we are a burden." Ellie listened, her own eyes shining. "It's a lie," Abby said firmly. "Sharing your pain doesn't make a woman weak. It makes her human. We have a right to our grief. We have a right to be broken, and we have a right to ask for the space to piece ourselves back together. Keeping it locked in the dark, it just rots the foundation." She placed one of the tiny shoes in Ellie's hand. "His name was Samuel," Abby said. "Samuel," Ellie repeated. They stood in the quiet kitchen, 2 women, holding space for the ghost of a boy. Abby realized something else, too. Her smile at the market had been a trick of the light, a reflection of grief, but Silas Thorne's reaction to it, his quiet respect, his refusal to accept charity, his silent purchase of medicine for his men, that had been entirely real. The smile had been for a ghost, but it had brought a very real, very honorable man to her door. October rolled into Redemption Creek on a dry, bitter wind. It kicked up the red dust, coated the windows, settled into the cracks of the wooden boardwalks. Change was coming on that wind. You couldn't see it, but you could feel it. Rumors of the railroad expanding out of Fort Worth were no longer just whispers in the saloon. They were loud conversations at the general store. Progress, iron and steam. It meant money. It meant the town was going to grow. Jedediah Montgomery knew it better than anyone. He sat behind a heavy oak desk in his law office. The brass nameplate on his door was polished to a high shine. His suit was wool, impeccably cut. Not a speck of dust on it. Across from him sat a farmer named Miller. Miller's hands were shaking. His knuckles were thick and scarred from pulling stumps. "Jedediah," Miller pleaded. "Mr. Montgomery, the drought hit the corn hard. I just need another month on the loan. The railroad surveyors are buying up beef. I can sell 3 head of cattle next week." Jedediah folded his clean, manicured hands. He offered a sympathetic, deeply hollow smile. "I am sorry, Elias, truly, but the bank has rules. A contract is a contract." Jedediah didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The paper on it did the violence for him. "I'll have the sheriff post the foreclosure notice tomorrow," Jedediah said softly. "It's for your own good. You can't fight the future." Miller stood up. Defeated, he walked out into the dusty street, a ruined man. Jedediah pulled a map from his drawer. He marked a red X over Miller's plot. Then, his eyes drifted down the map, toward the center of town, toward a small, seemingly worthless corner lot where a weekly market was held. He smiled, a cold, calculating thing. The law was a weapon, and Jedediah Montgomery never fired a shot without knowing exactly what he was going to hit. Across town, True Power moved a lot quieter. Abby carried a basket of dried eucalyptus and willow bark into Doc Harrison's clinic. The room smelled of iodine and stale pipe tobacco. "Set it on the table, Abby," the old doctor called from the back room. "Be right out." She set the basket down. She was tired. The market had been slow. Her boots needed resoling. The front door opened. The little brass bell above it chimed. Silas Thorne walked in. He took his hat off. The room suddenly felt smaller. He filled it up, not just with his size, but with his gravity. He saw Abby. He stopped. He didn't offer a slick greeting. He didn't try to charm her. He simply gave her that same deliberate nod. Abby nodded back. "Mr. Thorne?" Silas walked to the counter. He stood a respectful distance away. "Doc's in the back," Abby said. Silas tapped his throat, then gestured to a small tin of peppermint oil sitting on the shelf behind the counter. Abby understood. The dry wind, the dust. It was aggravating. Whatever injury lived inside his neck. She stepped behind the counter. She picked up the tin. She held it out to him. Silas reached for it. His large, rough fingers brushed against hers, just for a second. It wasn't a romance novel moment. There were no fireworks. It was simply the contact of 2 people who knew the exact weight of a hard day's work. It was grounded, real. Doc Harrison came out, wiping his hands on a towel. "Silas?" "Abby," he said, looking between them. He had a Dr. S. eye. He saw the quiet space they were sharing. He didn't intrude on it. "I see you found the peppermint. Put it on my tab, Silas." Silas nodded. He tipped his hat to Abby. He walked to the door. He opened it. He stepped through, but he didn't let it swing shut. He stood on the boardwalk, holding the heavy oak door open, looking back at Abby. Waiting. He wasn't rushing her. He wasn't demanding she follow. He was just offering a clear path. Abby picked up her empty basket. She walked to the door. She stepped out onto the boardwalk. "Thank you," she murmured. Silas let the door click shut. He walked to his horse. He didn't speak a word. But Abby felt more seen in that 30-second encounter than she had in 3 years of polite town conversations. Sunday came. The church bell rang over Redemption Creek. Abby and Ellie walked in their best, faded but impeccably clean. Before they reached the wooden steps, Ellie stopped. She pointed toward the cemetery fence. The heavy autumn wind had snapped a wooden rail near the back. Silas Thorne was there. His suit coat was draped over a headstone. His sleeves were rolled up. He was swinging a hammer, driving long iron nails into the fresh wood. He wasn't inside the church, listening to the sermon. He was outside, fixing the boundary that kept the wild dogs away from the town's buried loved ones. He didn't ask for payment. He didn't ask for an audience. After the service, Reverend Cole stood on the steps, shaking hands. The congregation filed out. Ellie lingered behind her mother. She watched Silas, who was now putting his coat back on, packing his tools into a leather saddlebag. Reverend Cole followed her gaze. He smiled, a warm, knowing smile. He placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. He wanted her to understand the lesson playing out in front of her. "You see that man, Ellie?" the Reverend asked quietly. Ellie nodded. "He doesn't talk much." "No, he doesn't," the Reverend agreed. "But listen to me, child. Humanity in this town isn't measured by the fancy words we speak or the silk we wear on Sunday." He pointed to the repaired fence. "It's measured by the empty spaces we are willing to fill for others when they fall. A loud man promises to build you a house. A good man just hands you a hammer. Pay attention to the hands, Ellie, not the mouth." Ellie looked at the fresh wood on the fence. Then she looked at Silas mounting his horse. She pulled her little notebook from her pocket, and she began to draw. The Dusty Horn Saloon was loud on a Friday night. Smelled like stale beer, sweat, cheap cigars. A cattle buyer from Kansas City was leaning against the long mahogany bar. His name was Calloway. He wore a loud pinstripe suit and a gold pocket watch. He had been buying drinks for the room, trying to make friends, trying to make deals. He was also drunk and angry. "I don't get it," Calloway slurred, slamming his shot glass down. "I rode all the way out to that ironwood spread. Offered top dollar for 100 head of steer. Martha Higgins, the innkeeper, was sitting at a corner table, nursing a cup of tea. She pricked her ears up. "And?" the bartender asked, wiping a glass. "And the bastard just stared at me," Calloway shouted. He threw his arms up. "I gave him my pitch. Best prices in Missouri. The man didn't say a single damn word to me. He just looked at me like I was a stray dog on his porch, shook his head, and walked away." A few of the local men muttered in agreement. "That's Silas Thorne for you," a ranch hand grumbled. "Thinks he's royalty." "Arrogant," Calloway spat. "Elitist. Man gets a few thousand acres, and suddenly the rest of us aren't worth the breath it takes to say hello. He's a cold, stuck-up son of a bitch." The saloon door banged open. Doc Harrison stepped inside. He had his black medical bag in one hand. He looked exhausted. He walked straight to the bar. "Whiskey." "Neat." He downed it in one swallow. He set the glass down. Then he turned his head and looked dead at Calloway. The saloon went quiet. Doc Harrison was the closest thing this town had to a saint. When he was angry, people listened. "You're a fool, Calloway," Doc said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a razor. Calloway bristled. "Excuse me?" Doc picked up his empty glass. He rolled it between his fingers. "You think Silas Thorne is arrogant? You think he doesn't talk to you because he thinks he's better than you? That's exactly what I think." Calloway sneered. Doc Harrison let out a dry, humorless laugh. He turned to face the entire room. "2 years ago," Doc said, his voice echoing off the wooden walls. "Fall of '76. A lightning strike hit the main barn at Ironwood. Place went up like a powder keg. 3 men were trapped inside. The room was dead silent. A few of the older men lowered their heads. They remembered the smoke on the horizon that day. 2 of those men were drifters," Doc continued. "One was a Mexican stable boy, not a dime to their names. Nobody would have missed them if they burned." Doc stepped closer to Calloway. "Silas Thorne didn't send his foreman in. He didn't wait for the fire wagon. He soaked a blanket in the horse trough and ran straight into hell. Calloway swallowed hard. He pulled the two drifters out, Doc said. Then he went back in for the boy. The roof collapsed. Silas was trapped under a burning beam for 10 minutes. He breathed in superheated smoke. It burned the lining of his throat, melted his vocal cords. Doc slammed the glass down on the bar. He talks, Doc snarled, but every time he pushes a word out, it feels like swallowing ground glass. He chooses not to speak because of the pain, Calloway. Not because of his pride. Martha Higgins put her hand over her mouth. Doc pointed a finger at the cattle buyer's chest. A Mexican ranch hand's life is worth the exact same as a boss's life. That's God's law, and it's Silas Thorne's law. He traded his own voice so the lowest men on the totem pole could keep breathing. Doc picked up his medical bag. He adjusted his hat. He doesn't owe you a damn explanation, Calloway, and he sure as hell doesn't owe you small talk. Doc walked out of the saloon. The doors swung back and forth behind him. Nobody touched their drinks. The next morning, Abby was setting up her stall. Martha Higgins walked over. She didn't buy any jam. She just leaned close. Abby, Martha whispered, did you hear what happened at the Horn last night? Abby shook her head. I don't listen to saloon gossip, Martha. This ain't gossip. It's history. Martha told her every word Doc Harrison had said. The fire, the rescue, the ruined throat. Abby's hands went still over her dried yarrow. The air rushed out of her lungs. She remembered the way Silas's voice sounded when he bought the herbs. Deep, grating, like two stones grinding together. She remembered the wince in his jaw. She remembered how he had looked at Elias, the black ranch hand, and forced himself to speak anyway. Pain doesn't discriminate. Abby had to sit down on her wooden crate. She felt a wave of profound shame wash over her. She had judged him. Even after the herbs, a part of her had still thought of him as the distant, aloof rich man. She realized how incredibly wrong she was. Society told women to stay silent, to be polite, to be agreeable. It was a silence of submission. Silas Thorne's silence was something else entirely. It was a scar. It was a badge of honor. It was the physical cost of holding someone else's life higher than his own comfort. He walked through town every single day, letting people call him arrogant, letting them call him cold, and he never defended himself. Because a man who knew his own soul didn't need the town's approval to sleep at night. Abby looked down at the tiny pair of leather shoes sitting in a box beneath her counter. We all carry invisible wounds, she thought. Some are buried in the heart. Some are burned into the throat. She looked up, scanning the dusty road leading into town, hoping for the first time in a long time to see a copper-colored horse riding in. Mid-October brought a chill that settled deep in the bones. The Texas heat finally broke. In its place came a crisp, biting wind that stripped the cottonwoods of their leaves. Abby drove her small wagon out past the town limits. The sun was just peeking over the horizon. The sky was the color of bruised plums. She was heading to the eastern hills. Ironwood Ranch territory. Silas had sent word through Doc Harrison. The eucalyptus is blooming. Tell her she can harvest what she needs. No strings attached. No request for a percentage of her sales. Just an open gate. Abby brought her wagon to a halt at the base of the ridge. The air here was different, clean, sharp with the medicinal scent of the silver-green eucalyptus leaves. She tied off the reins, grabbed her canvas sack and a small pruning knife, and started the climb. She worked for an hour. The work was hard. The good branches were high. She stood on her toes, reaching for a thick cluster of leaves. Her fingers brushed it. Just an inch too far. She gritted her teeth and stretched. A shadow fell over her. Abby didn't jump. She just turned her head. Silas Thorne was standing there. He wore a heavy canvas coat and a worn Stetson. He didn't say good morning. He didn't ask if she needed help. He just reached up. His arm was a foot longer than hers. His hand closed around the branch. He pulled it down, just enough to bring it to her eye level. He held it steady. Abby looked at the branch. Then she looked at him. He gave her a slight nod. Cut. She took her pruning knife and sliced through the thick stem. Silas caught the heavy bundle before it hit the dirt and placed it gently into her canvas sack. They didn't speak a word. For the next 2 hours, they moved along the ridge together. A silent choreography. When the branches were low, Abby cut them. When they were high, Silas pulled them down. He didn't take her knife. He didn't try to do the work for her. He simply filled in the gaps where her reach ended. They were two capable people, sharing the labor. It was a profound kind of respect. Society told men to take over, to protect the weaker sex by doing everything for them. Silas didn't do that. He recognized her competence. He just made the job a little easier. True partnership doesn't require constant validation. It doesn't need to announce itself. It's built on shared effort. That was the unspoken law of the morning. By noon, the wagon was full. Abby wiped the sweat from her forehead. The air was cold, but the work had warmed her blood. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," Abby said. Silas was tying down the canvas tarp over the back of her wagon. He finished the knot, gave it a hard tug to test the tension, and turned to her. He touched the brim of his hat. He walked to his copper gelding, mounted up, and rode off to check his fence line. No lingering, no expectation of a shared lunch or a flirtatious chat. Abby watched him go. A strange, unfamiliar warmth bloomed in her chest. For the first time since her husband died, she didn't feel completely alone against the world. The trouble started on the way back. The sun was dropping fast. The Texas dusk is notoriously short. 1 minute the sky is fire. The next minute, it is pitch black. Abby was 2 miles from town when she heard it. Clink, scrape. Her old mare, Nellie, stumbled. The wagon lurched. Abby pulled back on the reins. "Whoa, easy, girl." She climbed down from the wagon seat. The light was fading fast. She ran her hand down Nellie's front left leg and lifted the hoof. The iron shoe was hanging by a single bent nail. The rest had sheared off on a jagged rock. Abby cursed under her breath. A horse couldn't pull a loaded wagon on a bare hoof over rocky ground. Not without going permanently lame. She was stuck. She looked at the darkening road. It was a long, dangerous walk back to town in the dark. Hoofbeats approached from the west. Slow, steady. Abby stood up, her hand instinctively resting on the heavy iron wrench she kept under the wagon seat. A woman alone on the road at night couldn't afford to be trusting. A massive silhouette emerged from the gloom, the copper gelding. Silas pulled up next to her wagon. He looked at her, then he looked at the horse's leg. He dismounted. He didn't ask what was wrong. He already knew. He unbuckled a leather saddlebag from his horse and dropped it in the dirt. It clanked. Farrier tools. "Hold her head," Silas rasped. His voice was rough, scraping against the quiet evening. But it wasn't a demand. It was a request for teamwork. Abby moved to Nellie's head. She stroked the mare's nose, murmuring softly to keep her calm. Silas knelt in the dirt. He pulled a heavy pair of iron pincers from his bag. With one smooth, powerful motion, he popped the ruined shoe off. He didn't have a forge to heat a new one, but he had a spare in his bag and a rasp to file the hoof flat. He worked in the fading light. The metallic ring of his hammer, striking the nails, was rhythmic, steady. Abby watched his hands. Big, calloused, but incredibly precise. He didn't rush. He didn't get frustrated when the mare shifted her weight. He just held steady until the animal settled. In 15 minutes, the job was done. Silas stood up. He wiped his hands on his canvas coat. It was fully dark now. The moon was hidden behind a thick bank of clouds. Silas walked to his saddlebag. He pulled out a hurricane lantern. He struck a match against the heel of his boot and lit the wick. Yellow light spilled over the dirt road. He didn't offer to drive her wagon. He didn't offer to follow her all the way into town to make sure she was safe. That would have been treating her like a child. Instead, he walked to the front of her wagon. He hung the lit lantern on the iron hook beside her driver's seat. He gave her the light, but he left the reins in her hands. Empowering someone means giving them the tools to find their own way. It doesn't mean carrying them. Go on, Silas said quietly. Abby climbed up to the bench. She took the reins. She looked down at him, standing in the shadows just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow. I won't forget this, she said softly. Silas just tipped his hat. He stepped back into the dark. Abby clicked her tongue. Nellie stepped forward. The newly secured shoe hit the dirt solid and true. Abby drove the rest of the way home, while guided by light Silas had left her. The peace of that evening didn't last. The next morning, the reality of Redemption Creek came knocking at Abby's door. Literally. 3 sharp, polite raps on the wood. Abby wiped the flour from her hands and opened the front door. Jedediah Montgomery stood on her porch. He was wearing a charcoal wool suit. A gold watch chain hung across his vest. He smelled of bay rum and expensive cigars, a smell that completely clashed with the simple, honest scent of baking bread in Abby's kitchen. Good morning, Abigail, Jedediah said. His voice was smooth as oil. Jedediah, Abby replied. She didn't open the door any wider. What brings you out here? Jedediah smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Just checking on my late brother's family. May I come in? Abby hesitated. But refusing a lawyer on your porch in broad daylight was a good way to invite trouble. She stepped aside. Jedediah walked into the small house. He looked around. His eyes catalogued the worn furniture, the lack of luxury. He looked like a wolf inspecting a sheep pen. Ellie was sitting at the table, doing schoolwork. She stiffened. She didn't like her uncle. He made her skin crawl. I'll get right to the point, Abigail, Jedediah said, turning to face her. I was looking over the county tax ledgers yesterday. It seems you are behind on the property taxes for the market plot. Abby's jaw tightened. I have until the end of the month. Technically, yes, Jedediah said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his breast pocket. But the debt is $23.50. That is a considerable sum for a woman selling jam. If you fail to pay, the county will seize the land. You will lose your stall. Abby crossed her arms. I will have the money, will you? Jedediah feigned sympathy. He sighed heavily. Abigail, James left you that plot to take care of you. But it's a burden. You shouldn't have to break your back hauling herbs to pay the county. He stepped closer. I am prepared to do you a favor, he said quietly. Sign the deed over to the bank. I will forgive the tax debt entirely. I'll even write you a check for $50. You can buy Ellie proper winter clothes. You can rest. Abby looked at the piece of paper in his hand. $50. It was more cash than she had seen in a year. It meant warmth. It meant food. But she looked at Jedediah's eyes. They were entirely too hungry for a plot of dirt that barely held a wooden stall. Something was wrong. No, Abby said. Jedediah's fake smile slipped, just a fraction of an inch. Abigail, be reasonable. You are a widow. You have no legal standing to fight the county if they come to collect. I said no, Jedediah. Abby's voice was like iron. I have until the end of the month. I will pay the tax. The polite mask dropped completely. Jedediah's face turned hard, cold, Pride is a dangerous thing for a poor woman, Abigail, he said. The oil in his voice was gone. Now it was just a threat. The world is moving fast. Don't stand in the way of a train you can't stop. I'll see you at the end of the month. He turned on his heel and walked out. The door clicked shut behind him. The small house was deathly quiet. Ellie looked up from her slate. Her hands were shaking. She had heard every word. She understood enough about money to know that $23 might as well be 1,000. Ma, Ellie whispered, what are we going to do? Should we take the $50? We need the money. Abby stood frozen for a moment. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. Fear wanted to take over. She took a slow, deep breath. She walked over to the wooden table. She sat down directly across from her daughter. She reached out and took Ellie's, shaking hands in her own calloused ones. She needed Ellie to hear this, not just to calm her down, but to arm her for the world she was going to grow up in. Ellie, look at me, Abby said firmly. Ellie looked up. Her eyes were wide and frightened. You listen to me, and you remember this for the rest of your life, Abby said. Her voice was steady now. The fear was gone, replaced by a fierce, undeniable resolve. The world is going to try to buy you out. Men like your Uncle Jedediah will use polite words and offer you a fraction of what you are worth, and they will call it a favor. Abby squeezed her daughter's hands. A woman's dignity doesn't lie in finding a man to lean on, Ellie. It doesn't lie in taking the easy money to hide from a storm. It lies in having the legal right to decide what happens to the dirt beneath her feet. Ellie stared at her mother, soaking in the words. That plot of land, Abby continued, her eyes burning with conviction, is not just a market stall. It is independence. If you own the dirt, you own your voice. If you let them take the dirt, you belong to them. Abby let go of Ellie's hands and stood up. She looked toward the door where Jedediah had just stood. I won't back down, Abby stated, the words echoing in the small room. I will not sell. I am holding this land for your name, Ellie, and no man in a wool suit is going to take that away from us. Do you understand? Ellie looked at her mother. The fear in the young girl's eyes melted away. In its place, a spark of the exact same iron resolve ignited. Ellie nodded slowly. I understand, Ma. Abby picked up her flour-dusted apron and tied it back around her waist. The battle lines were drawn. The silence was over. She didn't know how she was going to get the $23. But she knew one thing for certain. She was going to fight. Abby didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table in the dark. A single tallow candle burned down to a stub. $50. Jedediah Montgomery was a greedy man. He didn't give away a single copper penny unless it promised to bring back a silver dollar. Offering $50 for a dirt corner lot with unpaid taxes made no sense unless the dirt was worth a fortune. At daybreak, Abby put on her boots. She didn't go to the market. She went to the church. The sanctuary was empty. Dust motes danced in the pale morning light, streaming through the stained glass. It smelled like old paper and pine polish. Reverend Cole was at the altar, arranging hymnals. He looked up. He saw the hard, sleepless set of her jaw. Abigail, he said quietly, you look like a woman chasing a ghost. I'm chasing the truth, Reverend, Abby said. Her voice echoed in the empty room. When James died, Jedediah handled the estate. He told me the market plot was mine to use, but the deed remained with the bank until the taxes cleared. Reverend Cole stopped moving. He set the hymnals down. He let out a long, heavy sigh, the kind of sigh that comes from carrying a secret for too long. The law was built by men with money, Abigail, to protect men with money, the Reverend said. His voice was firm, resonant. Corruption dresses up in a three-piece suit and calls itself the law. But the truth doesn't need a courthouse to make it real. He stepped down from the altar. He walked to the small wooden pulpit, opened a hidden drawer in the back, and pulled out a sealed yellowed envelope. He held it out to her. James gave me this 3 days before the fever took him, Cole said. He told me to hold it, to give it to you only if Jedediah ever tried to force you off the land. Abby's hands shook as she broke the wax seal. She pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a legal document, a copy of the true will, signed by James, witnessed by the Reverend and Doc Harrison. She read the words. The market plot known as Lot 12 is placed in an unassailable trust for my daughter, Eleanor. Abigail Montgomery retains full administrative rights. The land cannot be sold, mortgaged, or seized for any debt held by my brother, Jedediah. At the bottom, in James' messy scrawl, was a personal note. Abby, I heard the railroad surveyors drinking at the tavern. They bringing the Fort Worth line right through the center of town. Right through Lot 12. Jedediah knows. He will try to starve you out to take it. Don't let him rob our girls. Abby lowered the paper. The pieces snapped together. The cold, ugly picture was finally complete. It wasn't about unpaid taxes. It was about a train depot. That dirt patch was going to be worth thousands. Jedediah was trying to steal her future. He has the original document locked in his office safe, Abby whispered. He's been lying for 3 years. He has, Reverend Cole agreed gently. Abby folded the paper. She put it in her apron pocket. The fear she had felt the day before was entirely gone. It was replaced by a cold, burning anger. She knew what she had to do, but she also knew she couldn't do it alone. A woman walking into a powerful man's office, accusing him of fraud, would be laughed out into the street. The sheriff owed Jedediah money. The judge dined at Jedediah's house. She needed a witness, someone Jedediah couldn't buy, someone he couldn't intimidate. She needed a mountain to block the door. It was a 4-mile ride to the Ironwood Ranch. Abby drove her wagon up the long, dusty driveway. The ranch was massive, acres of rolling grassland, sturdy wooden fences. A bunkhouse that looked better built than half the homes in town. She found Silas Thorne in the open-air forge near the stables. He was wearing heavy leather chaps and a thick canvas shirt, sleeves rolled up past his elbows. He was holding a glowing iron horseshoe with a pair of tongs, bringing a heavy hammer down on it. Clang, clang, clang. The rhythm was brutal, powerful. He saw her wagon approach. He stopped. He lowered the hammer and plunged the hot iron into a barrel of water. A hiss of white steam shot into the air. Silas wiped his brow with the back of his arm. He walked out of the forge. He didn't say a word. He just waited. Abby climbed down from the wagon. She walked up to him. She didn't flutter her eyelashes. She didn't put on a distressed, helpless voice. I need a favor, Mr. Thorne, Abby said flatly. And it's not for money. Silas watched her, his dark eyes unreadable. He gave a sharp nod. Speak. My brother-in-law has been hiding the true copy of my husband's will, Abby explained, keeping her voice perfectly steady. He is trying to steal my land because the railroad is coming. I am going to his office right now to demand the original document. Silas didn't blink. He just listened. I know how men like Jedediah operate, Abby continued. If I go in there alone, that piece of paper will accidentally catch fire. If I scream, they will call me a hysterical widow. I don't have power in that room. She looked him dead in the eye. If I walk in with you, he won't try a thing. I don't need you to fight for me, Mr. Thorne. I don't need you to talk for me. I just need you to stand in the room. It was a profound request. In 1878, men were expected to fight women's battles, to step in front, to take control. Abby was asking him to step behind her, to let her lead her own charge. Silas looked at the fierce, unbending pride in her gray eyes. He didn't ask questions. He didn't ask to see the proof. He trusted her completely. He turned. He grabbed his wool coat off a wooden peg. He shrugged it on over his work shirt. He walked to the stable, threw a saddle on his copper gelding, and led the horse out. He swung up into the saddle. He looked down at her. He tipped his hat toward town. Lead the way. Jedediah Montgomery was enjoying a fine imported cigar. He sat in his leather chair, looking at the map of the new railroad lines. His future was golden. In 2 days, the tax deadline would hit. The widow would default. He would swoop in, buy the debt from the county, and seize the deed. The brass doorknob turned. Jedediah frowned. My office is closed until... The door opened. Abby walked in. Her spine was perfectly straight. Her chin was up. Jedediah rolled his eyes, setting his cigar in an ashtray. Abigail, I told you my offer stands until tomorrow. There is no need for tears or... He stopped speaking. The color drained out of his face. The doorway went dark. Silas Thorne stepped into the office. He had to duck slightly to clear the frame. He didn't take off his hat. He didn't offer a greeting. He walked 2 steps in, crossed his massive arms over his chest, and leaned his shoulder against the wall, right next to the door. He became a human blockade, silent, immovable, and incredibly dangerous. Jedediah swallowed. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. He looked at Silas, then back to Abby. Mr. Thorne, Jedediah stammered. I don't handle business for Ironwood. What can I do for you? Silas didn't answer. He didn't even look at Jedediah. He kept his eyes fixed on the far wall. Abby stepped right up to the mahogany desk. She pulled the folded paper from her pocket and slapped it down on the polished wood. The sound cracked like a gunshot. You can open your safe. Jedediah, Abby said. Her voice was ice. And you can hand me the original copy of James's will. Jedediah looked at the paper on his desk. He recognized Reverend Cole's handwriting on the seal fragment. Panic flared in his eyes. He tried to recover. He tried to put on the mask of the patient, educated man dealing with a foolish woman. Abigail, you are confused, Jedediah said, forcing a condescending smile. Legal matters are highly complex. A woman's mind isn't built to navigate the nuances of property trusts and tax codes. You are overstepping your understanding. Abby leaned over the desk. She placed her hands flat on the wood, bringing her face inches from his. A woman's mind isn't too frail to understand when she's being robbed, Abby said clearly, her words ringing with absolute authority. The law isn't a boys' club anymore, Jedediah. It is written in plain English, and I can read. I know about the trust. I know about the Fort Worth Railroad. And I know you are a thief. Jedediah's face turned purple. He stood up, slamming his hands on the desk. How dare you, he shouted. I am a respected man in this town. I am the law in this town. You will not come into my office and threaten me. I will have the sheriff throw you both out. Abby didn't flinch. Silas moved. It wasn't a big movement. He just pushed off the wall and dropped his arms to his sides. The heavy thud of his boots hitting the floorboards echoed in the room. He took one single step forward. He didn't draw a gun. He didn't raise a fist. He just stood there, all 6 feet and broad shoulders of him, staring whole straight through Jedediah Montgomery. The silence radiating from the rancher was heavier than any shout. It was a promise of absolute ruin. Jedediah froze. His breathing hitched. The bravado evaporated in a second. He looked at Silas. He saw the cold, hard reality of a man who had walked through fire and didn't care about a lawyer's empty threats. Abby kept her eyes entirely on Jedediah. She didn't look back at Silas for rescue. She knew he had her back. Open the safe, Jedediah, Abby commanded. Jedediah's hands shook. He looked at Silas one more time. Then, utterly defeated, he turned around. He spun the dial on the heavy iron safe in the corner. Click, click, click. He pulled the heavy door open. He reached inside and pulled out a thick parchment document bearing the county seal. He set it on the desk. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Abby picked it up. She unfolded it. She checked the signatures at the bottom. James, Doc Harrison. Reverend Cole. It was real. She folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. You think you've won? Jedediah sneered, his voice shaking with venom as he sank back into his chair. You have the deed. So what? The county tax is still due in 2 days. The law is the law. If you don't have $23.50, the county seizes the land anyway. You just delayed the inevitable, Abigail. Abby looked at him with pure disgust. We are done here. She turned around. She walked toward the door. Silas stepped back. He opened the door for her. He let her pass through first. Then he stepped out onto the boardwalk and pulled the door shut behind them with a firm click. They stood outside in the afternoon sun. The town moved around them. Wagons rolled by. People walked the boardwalk. No one knew that a war had just been fought and won inside that room. The adrenaline suddenly drained out of Abby. Her knees went weak. Her hands started to tremble uncontrollably. She leaned back against the wooden siding of the building, taking a deep, shuddering breath. She pressed her hand against her pocket, feeling the thick parchment inside. Safe. Ellie's future was safe. Silas stood a few feet away. He watched her. He saw the tremor in her hands. He didn't step in to coddle her. He just gave her the quiet space to steady herself. Abby looked up at him, the man who had just dropped everything to be her shield. Thank you, she whispered. Her voice was thick with emotion. You didn't have to do that. Silas touched the brim of his hat. He turned and walked to his horse. He untied the reins. Mr. Thorne, Abby called out, pushing herself off the wall. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. Why didn't you say anything in there? She asked. When he started shouting at me. Most men would have stepped in, would have shouted back, would have taken over. Silas turned to face her fully. He looked at this remarkable woman, a woman who had fought tooth and nail for everything she had. He respected her, too much to ever try and fight her battles for her. True respect wasn't about rescuing a woman. It was about standing beside her while she rescued herself. Silas swallowed. His throat tightened. He pushed the air past his ruined vocal cords. Your fight, Silas rasped. The sound was harsh, but the meaning was incredibly gentle. Your voice. Abby stood motionless. The word settled deep into her chest. Silas mounted his horse. He gave her one last, steady look, then spurred the gelding and rode back toward Ironwood. Abby watched him go. The paper in her pocket was heavy, but her heart, for the first time in years, felt incredibly light. The morning train from St. Louis hissed into Redemption Creek at exactly 7 o'clock. The air was brittle. Frost coated the wooden planks of the station platform. Martha Higgins was sweeping the boardwalk in front of her inn. She paused. She leaned on her broom. She watched the passengers step down from the iron rail car. A traveling salesman, 2 cowhands, and a woman. Martha's hands tightened on the broom handle. The woman wore a heavy wool traveling dress. It was a city cut, dark blue, stylish. But if you looked closely, the hem was frayed. The lace at the collar was yellowing. She had dark, blonde hair pinned up under a simple hat. Her blue eyes scanned the dusty street. They didn't look arrogant. They looked tired, calculating, but exhausted. Beatrice Thorne had returned. Martha didn't run to the sheriff. She didn't shout. She just turned around, walked inside her inn, and locked the front door. She needed a minute to think. The ghost of Ironwood Ranch wasn't a ghost anymore. She had a name, and she had a claim. Beatrice stood on the platform. The cold wind bit through her coat. She hadn't come back for love. She was honest enough with herself to admit that. 4 years ago, she had left Silas and a 6-year-old boy. She had climbed onto a train with a silk merchant named Daniel Marsh. She thought the city would be brighter. She thought the music would play forever. It played for exactly 2 years. Then Marsh met a younger woman in Chicago. He left Beatrice in a rented room with a month's paid rent and a brief note. She had spent the last 2 years surviving, taking in sewing, working in a laundry. The city wasn't bright. It was a meat grinder. She came back to Redemption Creek because she was legally still married to a man who owned 4,000 acres of prime Texas grass. She came back because she was starving. But as she hired a wagon to take her out to Ironwood, her hands shook in her lap. She wasn't entirely heartless. She remembered Caleb's laugh. She remembered Silas's quiet, steady hands. She knew what she had thrown away. She was a woman who had made a terrible, selfish choice, and she was currently wearing the consequences of it. The wagon rolled up the long drive. Beatrice looked at the house. It looked exactly the same. Sturdy, immovable. She stepped down from the wagon. She paid the driver. She turned around. Silas was sitting on the front porch. He was oiling a leather bridle. He didn't look up when the wagon pulled in. He didn't drop his rag. He just kept working the oil into the leather in slow, rhythmic circles. Beatrice walked to the bottom of the wooden steps. "Silas," she said. Her voice wavered. Silas stopped rubbing the leather. He set the bridle down on a barrel. He stood up. He looked at her. He didn't look shocked. He didn't look angry. His dark eyes were completely flat, like looking at a calm, frozen lake. "Beatrice," he said. His voice was a harsh, scraping sound. Beatrice flinched. She hadn't heard that voice since the fire. It still shocked her. "You aren't surprised," she said, her brow furrowing. You knew I was coming." Silas gave a single nod. He reached into his coat pocket. "Pinkerton man." Silas forced the words out. It hurt his throat. He kept it brief. "St. Louis, last year, when Marsh left you." Beatrice stared at him. Her mouth fell open. "You had me followed, watched," Silas corrected, his voice grating. "To know you were safe for Caleb, alive in the world, even if she wasn't here. That was the truth." Silas hadn't tracked her down of malice. He had tracked her out of duty to his son. Beatrice felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She had spent the whole train ride preparing for a fight, preparing to demand her legal half of the ranch, to threaten him with lawyers. But Silas had already disarmed her. He had known she was broke. He had known she was coming. He was holding all the cards, and he wasn't even raising his voice. He walked down the steps. He held out a thick manila envelope. "What is this?" she asked, her voice shrinking. "Papers," Silas said. "Divorce. Drawn up in Austin. Legal." Beatrice looked at the envelope. "You can't just throw me out, Silas. I am your wife." "Half of this, no." Silas cut her off. The word was a heavy stone dropping into a quiet pond. He pulled a smaller envelope from his pocket. He held it out alongside the first one. $300, Silas rasped. Beatrice froze. $300 was a fortune. It was a new start anywhere in the country. Silas looked at her. He didn't hate her. Holding on to hate was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. He had let that go a long time ago. He took a slow, painful breath. He needed to say this clearly. He needed her to understand the boundary he was drawing in the dirt. "Forgiveness is a human privilege, Beatrice," Silas said. The words tore at his, but they were steady. "Absolute. I forgive you. I do. So, My boy doesn't grow up carrying a heart full of hate. He held the envelopes closer to her. But equality means no one gets the right to trample your boundaries twice, Silas continued, his dark eyes boring into hers. You are not a victim here. You made a choice. Now, I make mine. Take the money. Sign the papers. You have your freedom. You do not have this ranch. Beatrice looked at the money. Then she looked at the man. She realized in that moment just how small she was and how large he was. Not in physical size, in spirit. He wasn't punishing her. He was simply closing a door she had chosen to walk out of. She reached out with a trembling hand. She took both envelopes. I'll sign them, she whispered. Good, Silas said. Can I see him? She asked. The question broke halfway through. Just once. Silas didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the barn. He had prepared for this too. The night before, Silas had sat Caleb down on his bed. He hadn't sugarcoated it. He hadn't used metaphors. He had looked his 10-year-old son in the eye and told him the truth. Your mother didn't die, Silas had told him. She left. I lied because I thought I was protecting you. I was wrong. A boy deserves the truth. Caleb had sat quietly for a long time. Then he had asked if she was coming back. Silas had said no. She was just passing through. Silas turned back to Beatrice. Wait here. He walked to the barn. A few minutes later, he walked out. Caleb was beside him. The boy wore his work boots and a dusty shirt. He walked slowly. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Beatrice covered her mouth with her hand. Tears spilled over her eyelashes. Caleb, she choked out, look how tall you are. You have your father's shoulders. Caleb looked at her. His big brown eyes were calm. There was no anger in them, but there wasn't a desperate longing either. He looked at her the way you look at a photograph in a book, real but distant. Pa says you live in a city now, Caleb said. His voice was polite, even. I do, Beatrice cried, taking a half step forward. She wanted to hug him. She wanted to crush him to her chest. But Silas stepped subtly, placing himself just an inch between them. He didn't block her completely, but his presence was a physical boundary. He was protecting his son's right to decide how close to get. Caleb didn't step forward for a hug. He didn't want one. Instead, the 10-year-old boy held out his hand. It was a staggering gesture. A boy offering a handshake to his mother. It was formal. It was a closing of a ledger. Beatrice looked at the small, calloused hand. A sob broke in her throat. But she reached out. She took his hand. She shook it. I'm glad you ain't dead, ma'am, Caleb said softly. Have a safe train ride back. He let go of her hand. He looked up at Silas. Silas nodded. Caleb turned around and walked back to the barn. He didn't look back. Beatrice stood there, the reality of her choices finally crashing down on her in full weight. She had her money. She had her freedom. But she was entirely, profoundly empty. She sat on a wooden bench on the porch. She opened the manila envelope. Silas handed her a fountain pen. She signed the papers. Silas took them back. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just tipped his hat, turned around, and walked into his house. By noon, the story was halfway across Redemption Creek. By sunset, it was everywhere. Gossip is a funny thing. It takes the truth, runs it through a grinder, and spits out whatever flavor the town wants to taste. Martha Higgins had told the blacksmith she saw Beatrice. The blacksmith told the grocer that Beatrice took a wagon to Ironwood. The grocer told a farmer that Silas had brought his wife home. By the time the story reached the edge of town, the narrative was fixed. Silas Thorne's dead wife was alive, and she had moved back into the big house. Abby was out back, chopping firewood. The axe swung down. Thwack! A pine log split perfectly in two. She reached for another, set it on the stump. Swung again. Thwack! Martha Higgins came walking briskly down the dirt path. She didn't look like a gossip monger today. She looked genuinely worried. "Abby," Martha called out of breath. Abby buried the axe head into the chopping block. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Martha, what's wrong?" Martha wrung her hands. "I didn't want you to hear it from those hens at the general store. I wanted to tell you myself." Abby stood still. Her stomach gave a slow, cold roll. "Tell me what?" "It's Silas Thorne," Martha said gently. "His wife, she wasn't dead, Abby. She ran off a few years back. And, well, she came in on the morning train. She took a wagon out to his place. Folks are saying he took her back in." The autumn wind seemed to stop blowing. The world went incredibly quiet. Abby didn't gasp. She didn't drop to her knees. She just stared at the iron head of her axe embedded in the wood. She felt foolish. Completely, utterly foolish. She thought about the man who had stood beside her in Jedediah's office. The man who had fixed her wagon in the dark. The man who had looked at her with such quiet, burning respect. It wasn't hers. It never had been. He belonged to a ghost that had just walked back into the light. "Thank you for telling me, Martha," Abby said. Her voice was perfectly level, blank. "Abby, honey, I'm sorry. I know he favored you. He bought my herbs, Martha. That's all." Abby turned back to the woodpile. She pulled the axe free. "I have wood to chop. Good evening." Martha nodded sadly. She turned and walked back toward town. Abby swung the axe. It hit the log off center. The wood didn't split. The shock traveled up the wooden handle, jarring her bones. She swung again. Harder, angrier. The axe hit the dirt. She dropped the handle. She leaned her hands on her knees, taking deep, ragged breaths. She wasn't crying. She was just angry. Angry at the world. Angry at the lies men told. Angry at herself for daring to hope that she didn't have to carry the weight of her life alone forever. "Ma!" Abby snapped her head up. Ellie was standing on the back porch. She held a basket of washed laundry. She had heard the whole exchange with Martha. Abby straightened up. She immediately reached for her armor. "I'm fine, Ellie. Just missed the cut. Let's get that laundry hung up." "Stop it," Ellie said. Abby blinked. "Excuse me?" Ellie set the laundry basket down on the porch. She walked out into the yard. She stood right in front of her mother. The 15-year-old girl looked incredibly tall in that moment. "Stop putting the wall up," Ellie said firmly. "You just spent 2 weeks telling me that we don't have to be made of stone, that we are allowed to feel things." Abby opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. "You like him," Ellie said. "It wasn't a question. And you think he lied to you. He lied to the whole town." Abby shot back, her voice finally cracking. "His wife is alive. She's out there right now." Ellie crossed her arms. She looked at her mother with a wisdom that had been forged in the quiet corners of a hard life. "Ma," Ellie said, her voice dropping down to a gentle, steady cadence. "If you want the truth, go ask him. Don't trust the town." Abby shook her head. "I have no right. He isn't mine to question." "Yes, you do," Ellie insisted. She stepped closer. She placed her hand on her mother's arm. It was a profound reversal, the daughter anchoring the mother. "This town called him cold because he didn't talk," Ellie said clearly. "They called him arrogant. They were wrong. They were wrong about his voice. They were wrong about his heart. They've been wrong about him from the very start." Ellie looked deep into Abby's eyes. "Don't do what the town does. Ma, don't assume the worst. Because it has the easiest thing to believe. If a man stands beside you when you fight for your life, you owe him the respect of asking for his truth directly, not taking it from a rumor." Abby stood in the cold yard. She looked at her daughter. She saw the fierce, unbending logic, the demand for fairness. She had raised a good woman. Abby looked down at the axe. Then she looked toward the eastern hills, where the sun was setting over Ironwood Ranch. The anger drained away. In its place came a quiet, terrifying courage. She wasn't going to hide behind her pride. She was going to demand the truth, face to face. Wednesday broke gray and bitter. The wind off the plains carried the smell of frost. It whipped the dirt in the streets into tiny, stinging devils. Abby was out front, sweeping her porch. She was trying to steady her mind. She was going to ride out to Ironwood. She was going to look Silas Thorne in the eye and ask him the truth about his wife. Ellie was right. Hiding behind pride was just another way to lose. But trouble didn't wait for her to saddle the horse. Trouble walked up the road, wearing a tin star. Sheriff Dan Pryor stopped at the bottom of her steps. He was a good man, but he was a tired man, and he owed the bank a lot of money. He took off his hat. He didn't look her in the eye. "Morning, Abby," Dan said. His voice was heavy. "Dan," she replied. She stopped sweeping. She leaned on the broom. Dan pulled a folded yellow paper from his vest. He walked up the steps and handed it to her. His hand shook just a fraction. "I'm sorry, Abby. I truly am. But it's legal. Signed by the county judge this morning." Abby unfolded the paper. It was a writ of immediate collection. Jedediah hadn't waited for the end of the month. He had used his money to buy her tax debt directly from the county office. He was now her direct creditor. The terms were stamped at the bottom in thick black ink. Payment of $23.50 due in full, 48 hours, or forfeit of property lot 12. "He bought the debt," Abby whispered. "He did," Dan said softly. "He has the right to call it in. If you don't have the cash by Friday morning, I have to padlock the stall. I have to auction the deed on the courthouse steps. And Jedediah will be the only one bidding." Abby felt the porch tilt beneath her boots. $23. In 2 days. It was impossible. She might as well try to catch the moon in a bucket. "I have the original will, Dan," Abby said, desperation leaking into her voice. "James left it in a trust for Ellie. Jedediah can't touch it." "He isn't touching the trust," Dan explained, sounding miserable. "He's executing a tax lien. The county doesn't care who is on the deed. They just care about the dirt. And the dirt owes taxes." "I'm sorry, Abby. My hands are tied." Dan put his hat back on and walked away. Abby stood on the porch. The yellow paper fluttered in the cold wind. She had fought so hard. She had stood up to Jedediah. She had claimed her right to the land, but the system was a rigged game. A man with money could always buy a new rule. She went inside. She shut the door. She slid down the wood until she hit the floor. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury for women who had someone to catch their tears. She just sat in the dark, feeling the crushing, suffocating weight of total defeat. That evening, Silas Thorne rode into town. He didn't come for supplies. He had seen Dan Pryor nailing a copy of the public auction notice to the board outside the courthouse. Lot 12, default. Silas read it. He knew exactly what it meant. He rode straight to Abby's house. The sun was gone. The house was dark, except for a single lamp burning in the kitchen window. Silas dismounted. He walked up the wooden steps. He didn't knock loud, just 2 firm taps. The door opened. Abby stood there. She looked exhausted. The fire in her gray eyes was banked, dimmed. She looked at his broad shoulders. Then she looked past him, into the dark yard. "Where is she?" Abby asked. Her voice was flat. "Defeated." Silas frowned. "Who?" "Your wife," Abby said. It took everything she had to speak the words. "The town says she came back, that she's at Ironwood." Silas understood. The gossip mill. It worked faster than a telegraph. He didn't get defensive. He didn't rush to explain. He just gave her the absolute, unvarnished truth. "She came," Silas rasped. The night air was cold on his throat. She signed the divorce papers. I gave her money to leave. She took the noon train east. She is gone. Forever. Abby stared at him. The flat look in her eyes cracked. She left? Yes. And you? You didn't ask her to stay? Silas looked down at her. No. The silence stretched between them. The rumor was dead. The ghost was gone. But the yellow paper still sat on Abby's kitchen table. I saw the notice at the courthouse, Silas said gently. Abby looked away. She wrapped her arms around herself. Jedediah bought the debt. I have until Friday. I don't have the money, Mr. Thorne. I lost. No. Silas stepped closer. He didn't cross the threshold. He stayed outside on the porch, respecting her space. You didn't. He reached into his coat. He pulled out a leather wallet. I will not take a loan, Silas, Abby said sharply, stepping back. Her pride flared up, a final defensive shield. I won't owe you. I won't be a charity case. It's not a loan, Silas said. He didn't hand her the wallet. He looked her dead in the eye. I want to buy the land. From you, Silas pushed the words out. They were gravelly, hard. $300. Abby froze. 300? It's barely worth 50. It is to me, Silas said. I buy the land. I pay the county tax tomorrow. The rest of the money is yours. And I write a lease, giving you the stall, free, until Ellie is 18. Abby couldn't process the words. Why? Why would you do that? Silas stood perfectly still. He let the cold wind blow around them. He needed her to understand this. He needed to say it clearly, so she never doubted her own worth again. Because true care doesn't put a rope around someone's neck, Abby, Silas said. His voice was a harsh whisper, but it carried the weight of a mountain. I know you don't need a savior. I know you can survive anything, but you shouldn't have to. He looked at the fierce, tired woman in front of him. Men like Jedediah use money to strip you of your choices, Silas continued. I am using mine to give them back. The land stays yours in practice. The money gives you a cushion. Jedediah gets nothing, Abby stared at him. The armor she had worn for 3 years, the hard, unyielding iron she had wrapped around her heart to survive the grief of losing James, the grief of losing baby, Samuel, the grinding poverty. It broke. It didn't shatter violently. It just dissolved. She covered her mouth with her hand. A sob tore its way up her throat. She turned away, leaning her forehead against the doorframe. Her shoulders shook. The tears came fast and hot, washing away years of dirt and stress and fear. Silas didn't rush in. He didn't grab her. He didn't tell her to hush. He just stood there on the porch, a silent, immovable pillar in the dark. He witnessed her pain, and he didn't judge it. He held the space for her to fall apart, knowing she had the strength to put herself back together. When the tears finally slowed, Abby turned back to him. She wiped her face. She took a deep, shuddering breath. 300 is too much, she whispered. It's my price, Silas said. Abby looked at the dark-eyed man, a man who bought her medicine without asking, a man who held a lantern so she could find her own way, a man who was offering her a future with no strings attached. Okay, Abby said softly. I'll sell it to you. Silas gave a single, firm nod. He touched the brim of his hat. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock, Reverend Cole's office. He turned and walked down the steps. He rode away into the night. Abby stood in the doorway. She wasn't standing in the dark anymore. A week before Christmas, Redemption Creek was covered in a thin, brittle layer of ice. At the county clerk's office, Jedediah Montgomery was staring at a map. His face was the color of old ash. Across the desk sat a surveyor for the Fort Worth Railroad. The man was rolling up his blueprints. I'm sorry, Mr. Montgomery, the surveyor said, not sounding sorry at all. The ground tests came back. The soil at the center of town is too soft for the iron depot. We had to move the line. Jedediah couldn't breathe. Move it where? The surveyor tapped a spot north of town, up along the ridge. Solid bedrock. We struck a deal with the owner yesterday. We're releasing 20 acres from the Ironwood Ranch, Jedediah says. Stomach plummeted into a bottomless pit. He had borrowed heavily against his own bank. He had bought 4 useless lots adjacent to the market square, assuming the depot would make him rich. But Lot 12, Jedediah stammered. Worthless to us, the surveyor said cheerfully. Good day, sir. Jedediah sat alone in the office. The silence in the room was absolute. Greed is a blind dog. It chases the scent of meat right off a cliff. He had destroyed himself. Out at Ironwood, Silas stood by his fence line. He had signed the railroad lease that morning. The sum was staggering. $40,000 over 10 years. He looked toward town, toward Lot 12. He hadn't known. When he bought Abby's land, he didn't know the railroad was coming his way. He hadn't bought it as a grand investment. He had bought it simply to build a wall between Abby and a thief, just like the morning he bought her herbs. He hadn't bought them to show off. He bought them to heal his men. The universe has a strange symmetry. You do the right thing in the dark, and eventually it brings you into the light. Christmas Eve. The hearth fire blazed inside the Ironwood ranch house. It smelled of roasting beef and pine needles. There were 4 people at the heavy oak table. Abby, Ellie, Silas, Caleb. It wasn't a loud dinner. There were no raucous toasts, but there was a deep, settling peace. The kind of peace you only appreciate after surviving a long, brutal war. Ellie and Caleb were sitting on the rug by the fire. Ellie was showing him her sketchbook. She flipped to a drawing of a copper horse. Caleb smiled, a real wide grin. Abby stepped out onto the front porch. The night air was freezing. The stars looked like shattered glass scattered across black velvet. The wooden floorboards creaked. Silas stepped out beside her. He closed the door, muffling the sound of the children inside. He stood next to her, close but not touching. They looked out at the rolling, dark plains of Texas. I heard about Jedediah, Abby said quietly. Her breath plumed in the cold air. He put the bank up for sale. He's leaving town. He gambled, Silas said simply. And I heard about the railroad. Abby turned her head to look at him. They leased your ridge. Silas nodded. You didn't know, Abby said. It wasn't a question. When you bought my lot, you didn't know the train was coming to you. Silas turned his head. His dark eyes met hers. Didn't matter, Silas rasped. Abby's heart gave a slow, heavy thump against her ribs. She looked at this man, the silent rancher, the man the town called cold. He was the warmest fire she had ever stood beside. Silas, Abby murmured. Silas turned his body fully toward her. He took a breath. The cold air stung his ruined throat, but he didn't care. Some things needed to be spoken into the world. Abby, Silas said. His voice was rough, halting, but entirely steady. I know you can stand on your own. I know you survived the worst this world has. You don't need me to hold you up. He reached out. He took her bare, calloused hand in his large, scarred one. But I want to stand beside you, Silas said, looking deep into her eyes. He wanted to make this explicit, absolute, not because a man is supposed to lead, not because you owe me, because it is my choice. You are my choice. Equality and partnership. 2 pillars holding up a shared roof. Abby looked down at their joined hands. Then she looked up into his face. She smiled. It wasn't a smile for a ghost. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a smile for the man standing right in front of her. I choose you too, Abby whispered. She stepped forward. She didn't fall into his arms. She stepped into them. Silas wrapped his arms around her. He buried his face in her hair. It smelled like sage and wind. He held her tight, anchoring her to the earth and letting her anchor him right back. 2 days after Christmas, the morning sun slanted through the window of Abby's small kitchen. She was packing a few things into wooden crates. They were moving out to Ironwood by the new year. She sat down at the table. She pulled out a piece of fine parchment and a pen. She dipped the nib in ink. She began to write. Dear Mother, I haven't written in a long time. I was too busy being strong. I thought that if I admitted how much it hurt to lose James and to lose my little Samuel, the wind out here would just blow me away. Abby paused. She looked at the small wooden box on the table. Inside, it sat the tiny pair of leather baby shoes. She dipped her pen again. I realize now that the greatest right we have as human beings isn't just the right to be strong. It is the right to let someone see our wounds without the fear of being judged. Silas didn't buy my stall that day to buy my affection. He did it because he saw a woman surviving, and he wanted to honor her work. He gave me the space to be weak, so I could finally figure out how to be truly strong again. I am happy, Mother. For the first time in years, we are safe. Love, Abby. She folded the letter. She placed it inside the wooden box with the leather shoes. She closed the lid and fastened the brass latch. The ghost was finally put to rest. Sunday morning in Redemption Creek. The church bells rang, a bright, clear sound against the winter sky. The pews were full. The townsfolk were bundled in heavy coats. Abby sat in the third row. Ellie sat on her right. Silas sat on her left. Caleb sat next to Silas. It wasn't a scandal anymore. It was just a fact. The widow and the rancher. Two people who had walked through the fire and found each other in the smoke. Reverend Cole stood at the pulpit. He was preaching about grace. Not the grace you pray for, but the grace you extend to your neighbors. Halfway through the sermon, Caleb leaned over. He tugged gently on Silas' heavy wool sleeve. Silas leaned down. Caleb cupped his hand around his mouth. He whispered, loud enough for Abby to hear. Pa, Caleb whispered. Abby smells like sage and honey. It's better than the barn. Abby slapped a hand over her mouth. Her shoulders shook. She was trying desperately not to laugh out loud in the middle of a sermon. Silas looked at Caleb. Then he looked at Abby. He saw the joy dancing in her gray eyes. He saw the color in her cheeks. And slowly, surely, the corners of Silas Thorne's eyes crinkled. He didn't make a sound. He didn't have to. He smiled with his eyes, a genuine, deep, and total smile. Reverend Cole paused his sermon. He looked down at the third row. He saw the laughing woman. He saw the smiling man. He saw the two children sitting beside them. The Reverend tapped his finger on his Bible, smiled to himself, and continued talking about the light. Out in the market square, Lot 12 was empty for the winter. The dirt was frozen solid, but underneath the frost, the soil was resting, getting ready for the spring. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
If this story moved something inside you, give it a like, drop a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss the next story waiting for you here. There is a moment early in this story that I want you to hold on to. A woman stands in the dirt of a market square, swings a hammer, and drives a nail straight and true. A man walks by and tells her to step aside. She doesn't even look up. She just says, "My hammer weighs exactly the same as yours." And she keeps working. That single moment contains everything this story is about, because this is not a love story at its core. It is a story about dignity, about the quiet, daily, exhausting work of building a life when the world keeps telling you that you don't have the right tools, the right body, the right voice to do it. Abigail Montgomery was not a woman waiting to be saved. She was a woman who had already survived the unsurvivable, the death of a husband, the death of a baby she had bought shoes for before he ever drew a breath, and had chosen, stubbornly and relentlessly, to keep going. Not because she wasn't broken. She was. She was broken in ways she couldn't even speak aloud for years. But she showed up every single morning, set her stall, and did the work. Because she understood something that the Jedediah Montgomerys of the world will never understand. The dirt beneath your feet is not just land. It is your voice. It is your right to say no, to say yes, to say merci. Sadas. This is mine, and I built it. And then there is Silas Thorne. The town called him arrogant. They called him cold, distant, too proud to speak to ordinary people. They were wrong. They were spectacularly, completely wrong. Silas Thorne had traded his voice, the physical ability to speak without pain, so that 3 men nobody would have missed could keep breathing. He walked through fire and carried the cost of it in his throat every single day of his life, and he never once asked for credit. He never defended himself against the gossip. He just kept working. He kept fixing what was broken. He kept pouring medicine down the throats of the men at the bottom of the ladder because he believed in his bones that a man who bleeds for the land deserves to stand on it, regardless of the color of his skin, regardless of what the town thought of the arrangement. This story teaches us that the loudest people in the room are almost never the most powerful. True power is quiet. It is a lit lantern hung on a hook so someone else can find their way home. It is holding a branch down so a woman's knife can reach it without taking the knife from her hand. It is walking into a corrupt man's office and simply standing there, because sometimes the most radical thing a strong person can do is say, "This is your fight, your voice. I am just here so they know you are not alone."